In every community that I've participated in, there's always a sizable division between the fans. These divisions are caused, usually, by the developer. They will release a game in a series that is significantly different than the ones that came before. Some fans will like the change, some fans will not like the change, and some will have mixed feelings. These fans will then congregate into different groups that champion different opinions of what the future of the series should look like. Now, in the Monster Hunter community, it is often the case that Monster Hunter fans don't agree with each other on what the next title should look like. In fact, I think that the Monster Hunter community has many more divisions than is typical. There's the realism and speculative evolution people, the veteran pre-Monster Hunter World fans versus the people that started in World or Rise. And surprisingly, the biggest and probably most antagonistic groups are the Monster Hunter World fans versus the Monster Hunter Rise fans, despite the fact that they both come from the same generation. Although the gameplay loop remains mostly the same for all Monster Hunter titles, the experimentation between titles created specific gimmicks and aesthetic differences that spawned different interpretations on what the game's direction should be. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to talk about what the different groups are, what they want out of Monster Hunter, and what caused these divisions in the first place. In order to fully understand the different groups in the community, and why there is such a range of expectations from the fans on what the next title should look like, we first have to look at Monster Hunter's design philosophy, and how the team at Capcom develops their games. Early in the development of the original Monster Hunter, Capcom shifted from a typical fantasy setting into a more grounded setting, a setting that had fantastical elements, but that also had ecologically conscious explanations for those elements. In Monster Hunter Illustrations 1, there are interviews with the development team that discuss this shift in development. The following is a quote from the director. "We had it in our heads that this was going to be a fantasy game, so our ideas tended to gear towards magic and the like. The world as a whole was much more fantastical as well. I doubt any of us expected it to turn out so analog." The lead designer had this to say, "When we got down to the nitty-gritty of what kind of game is Monster Hunter going to be, really, that's when we dropped the whole magic system. One of the earliest concept movies we created showed a few hunters laying traps and luring a monster to their traps. In those movies, the monsters were always very generic fantasy monsters, like red dragons. Not only were they archetypal dragons, we also had them climbing out of the depths of ancient ruins, where they had no doubt been napping on a huge treasure hoard, so the game itself didn't have a strong connection to nature at first." So, Monster Hunter, early in its development, made a choice to lean away from the generic fantasy they had been working with. This shift in development would become their greatest asset, and make the Monster Hunter game world that we know today. This unique setting allows Monster Hunter to stand out next to other fantasy game worlds. Looking into the designs of the monsters in the series, we can see that the developers deliberately chose designs that made practical sense in a simulated ecological setting. Quote, "Every monster has a bunch of ideas incorporated into each part of its design, in order to give the player a better sense of how it lives within the game world. For instance, the hard-looking skin on a Lagambi's arms was designed to help it brake and change course while gliding, in addition to being resistant to damage. It would make me happy if players had fun, wondering why the monster's various parts are designed the way they are, while actually playing the game." So, as you can see, the monsters are designed to attempt to be realistic. The developers are trying to take their natural environment into account, and how that environment might have fueled their evolution. This focus on speculative evolution was always a priority. You can see in this artwork that they were always trying to make a unified family tree, where most wyverns evolved from a shelled lizard ancestor that adapted to various different environments and became those wyverns over time. Now, this is probably not canon, or is at least no longer canon. But the point is, they wanted things to make sense. They were trying to have reasons for why the monsters were the way they were. The following is a staff comment for the Monster Hunter Illustration 1. "Even those who do not draw have a set of preconceived notions regarding how a given creature moves. That's why we can't really fudge any major point with regards of a monster's physical structure and movements. If we do, the players are more likely to reject the reality of the monster in question. That's why we spend a lot of time not only on the skeletal structure, but also the meat and skin that we put on any given monster. It can be pretty difficult to try and imagine how the skin should hang off of a certain fictional creature, but as I look back through the illustrations for the game, I can see how we improved as we went along, and that makes me happy." So here they admit that they were trying to make the monster move in a realistic way, that both its appearance and its movement were a priority, and they wanted to avoid the player rejecting the reality of the monster in question. One of the best things about Monster Hunter is how it's not just visual and flavor text. These design choices often have gameplay implications. Like the Lagambi's arms, they're more resistant to damage because they were designed to help it stop and change directions while sliding on the ice. Another example that shows that they care about this even recently is Zitsuyaku. The following is a quote by Fujioka. "We wanted Zitsuyaku to be a grounded monster. That goes for its flash, too, which is different from past iterations, because it doesn't affect the whole field. We made it possible for the player to identify safe areas, because the zone in front of the ear flap lights up while everything behind the monster is safe. We added shells to its nest to increase the flash's effect, so it's a challenge on its home turf." I really like this detail. Zitsuyaku has an inherent inclination to collect reflective shells that increases the potency of its natural weapon when having to defend its home turf. And this is an adaptation that translates into the environment and the gameplay. Hirochika Nagaki in the Monster Hunter Illustrations 2 says, "For the Monster Hunter titles, I try to capture a sense of living creatures in the designs. That's the theme I follow. I take into consideration not just the thought of making them look cool, but also their dignity as wild creatures, and elements that would facilitate play as a game." To many players, this aspect of the game is so critical that it should be kept consistent and at the forefront at all times. Using Barroth as an example, that monster was designed entirely around its relationship with the environment. It uses the murky, muddy waters to hide from other creatures, but it also uses the mud to protect itself from the heat of the sun. Capcom even went out of their way to provide a pre-rendered cutscene of Barroth's behaviors outside of the limitations of their in-game engine. In the Barroth Ecology video, we can see the developer's vision of this fictional animal. And these concepts translate into gameplay. The behaviors that assist Barroth in survival suddenly become combat gimmicks in the player's battle against the monster. The mud isn't just a fancy visual in a cutscene, and it's not just flavor text in a description. It's integrated into the fight. It coats the Barroth in a protective layer. He slings it around at the hunter to inconvenience him. Quote, "For Barroth's design, I thought of a bulldozer clearing away sand and dirt, and combined it with the motif of a caterpillar's carapace. It was decided that this creature lives in bogs, so I figured that it would approach its prey covered in dirt and mud to hide its body. That's when I put the nostrils on the top of its head so that it could still breathe even when submerged in mud." So, the point is, Monster Hunter has always cared about realism in their designs. They want the monster designs to reflect its relationship with its environment, and if possible for that relationship to be expressed even in the gameplay, even in the hunt itself. However, Monster Hunter is also not afraid of adding some monsters that aren't grounded in reality at all. In fact, this is a deliberate part of the design process. When asked about the inclusion of blatantly fantastical monsters next to the more grounded ones, Kaname had this to say. "When you create a world full of mythical creatures like the Kirin, the entire world starts to feel like a very fantastical place with no basis in reality. Our focus for the world of Monster Hunter was to create a place that would feel like it could be real. By tossing in a decidedly fantasy-themed creature into this realistic world, it made the Kirin stand out in the player's eyes, and we hope that such an unexpected surprise will make the world a more exciting place for them to explore. That's why we made the decision to include creatures like Kirin." In a different staff comment, he says, "With Monster Hunter 2, we intentionally tried going with a more fantastical feel to our designs, and added new ancient dragon types. We also hoped that this new infusion of ancient dragon monsters would help make existing monsters like Rathian and Rathalos seem more realistic as far as this world was concerned." So, the purpose of elder dragons and other less realistic creatures is to provide a contrast. Their inclusion into a mundane world makes that world seem even more realistic in comparison. The elder dragon's fantastical nature is reflected even in the game's lore. To the characters, these archetypal fantasy dragons are so unusual that they can't be categorized as normal monsters. Now, in a different quote, Kaname says, "Still, we did manage to put together the feline and velociprey while we were working on the larger dragons. When you are dealing with nature and the creation of a natural environment, you can't help but fill the empty spaces with smaller critters. You can't create a full, vibrant world with just a bunch of boss monsters." So, it's clear that developers had always intended for these monsters to function in a simulated ecosystem with each other. They wanted the world to feel as real as possible. That's why the monsters in Monster Hunter will eat, drink, sleep, and communicate to one another in ways real-life animals do. They aren't mindless evil monsters out to destroy humanity. They are deliberately crafted animals that live and prey on each other in a fictional ecosystem. And it isn't the case that this is just something that they used to care about and now no longer do. Because in Monster Hunter World, they doubled down on the simulated ecosystem angle, and the developers pushed to take that concept to a new level. In an interview for World, Sugimoto said the following: "Once you've decided on a new concept for the next title, which in this case is a living, breathing ecosystem full of rich interactions between predator and prey monsters and little creatures, the hunters are jumping into this world, but even without you, it's kind of getting on with its own business being a realistic ecosystem." Now, for the speculative ecology fans, this is the heart of Monster Hunter. This is what differentiates it from its peers. They hyperfixate on these aspects, and they object when a monster design strays too far from that ideal and becomes unrealistic. And so they tend to butt heads with players that don't care at all about that and are just in Monster Hunter for the fun gameplay. After all, it doesn't matter how a Baroth's body or habits work within the context of a video game, where the objective is to administer damage to the monster. Even after all the work that went into making the ecosystems and world feel living and dynamic, those aspects are mostly irrelevant when you're grinding the same monster a dozen times. The process of creating a fantastical animal is helpful in creating a unique creature design and combat experience, but the details of this process are not important to the player once they're actually playing the game. Or rather, noticing these details and caring about them is optional. Alright, let's move on and talk about the Monster Hunter World versus the Monster Hunter Rise fans. And to do that, we need to talk about the differences between mainline and portable Monster Hunter games. Luckily, what we've already discussed with the speculative evolution fans will be useful because these groups tend to overlap in some places. In broad strokes, a mainline title is a numbered entry: Monster Hunter 1, 2, 3, 4, and Monster Hunter World. We know that Monster Hunter World is Monster Hunter 5 because it was confirmed by Ryozo Sugimoto, and he also explains that they changed the naming convention because they didn't want people to see Monster Hunter 5 and think, well, do I have to play the other 4? What if I'm lost? It was to prevent new players from being discouraged. But though they've dropped the numbering, the system hasn't gone away. They still release a mainline game and a portable game, and you can determine which is a mainline title by counting the number of dragon heads in the logo. Because Monster Hunter Wilds has 6 serpent heads in the logo, it is Monster Hunter 6. And as further evidence, a while ago there was a leak in Capcom. That leak revealed that internally they're still using the numbered naming conventions for Monster Hunter 6. Now I mention this because the mainline and portable games have distinct qualities. Typically, mainline titles put more focus on narrative storytelling, and by extension the developers also focus more on world building and thus fantasy ecology. Portable titles are less concerned with that. They put more focus on the gameplay loop, experimenting with player actions and their dynamics with the monsters. They tend to be more experimental and disregard previously established norms. Mainline titles tend to have a more nuanced narrative, focused on character dynamics and uncovering the mysteries of the ecological world. As for gameplay, the mainline titles tend to have slower, heavier, more methodical, more grounded combat. Portable titles tend to be flashier, faster, more experimental. Maybe most critically, mainline titles try to keep the ecological aspects in the forefront. It's incorporated into the overall art direction, and as a result, the art direction will appear more down to earth, more mundane, grittier. The portable titles are less interested in that. Both the characters and the locations will be louder and more expressive, and their monster designs are often less interested in adhering to the realism that Monster Hunter is known for. Now, these tendencies I'm describing are not absolute. The design direction of both the mainline and portable games will bleed into each other sometimes, and there are clear exceptions to all the things that I've said. But generally, it is the case that the games differ in the ways I've described. With all of this context, it should be easy to see why there's so much online contention between fans on which direction the series should go. Radically different art direction and gameplay changes between releases will generate wildly different interpretations of what Monster Hunter is and what it should be. When Monster Hunter World released, it was and continues to be its best-selling game of all time. It jettisoned the series into the mainstream. It's no exaggeration to say that most players were new players that had never touched the series. People that had been with the series for a long time and understood this difference between mainline and portable game were the minority. And so when Monster Hunter Rise was released, it appeared as a departure from everything World had set out to do. Even now, there are a huge number of Monster Hunter World fans that actively dislike Monster Hunter Rise. And even if they didn't outright dislike Rise, they certainly didn't want it going further into the Rise direction. They wanted the next Monster Hunter game after Rise to be more like Monster Hunter World. The real source of this conflict, I think, is that it wasn't clear that Capcom and Monster Hunter would continue in this mainline portable direction. The release of World began the 5th generation of Monster Hunter, and it changed so much so drastically that it made the future uncertain. There was a fear that Rise represented the permanent future of Monster Hunter as a whole, that the games would become much faster, less realistic, less interested in the monster ecology, more interested in rushing you from one fight to the next, and less interested in the preparation and hunting simulation aspect. Now that the trailer for Monster Hunter Wilds confirms that it is in fact Monster Hunter 6, and that they are going to keep the mainline portable distinction, I suspect that the World and Rise fans will have less to be antagonistic over. Alright, finally, the last group is the old Monster Hunter fans, the veteran fans, versus the new fans, which they consider to be people that started in Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise. Monster Hunter has been around for 20 years, and there's a vocal minority of veterans that are upset by the overall changes in the game's development since the earlier entries. Older fans have been clamoring for a return to form for a long time, and their group tends to overlap with the mainline fans and the speculative ecology fans. The veteran fans that I'm describing aren't just anybody that likes the old games. It's specifically the people that like the old games and don't like the new ones. They believe that too much of the old design was abandoned with Monster Hunter World, and Rise just exacerbated the problem. They weren't satisfied with Monster Hunter World because they believe that the clunkier design choices of the earlier titles managed to enhance the hunting simulation experience. The technical limitations in the old games created specific art directions and gameplay design choices that have since been gentrified to keep up with what's considered standard for AAA titles. Players that played the first 4 generations will be fond of gameplay mechanics that are now considered outdated, sluggish, or confusing. They are unhappy with things like the changing or removal of the tracking systems, bug nets and pickaxes being streamlined, the removal of hot and cold drinks, the ability to access your camp to manage your entire inventory after you've departed from a quest. They resent these changes being considered quality of life changes. They don't see them as quality of life changes, they see them as gameplay mechanics that incentivized careful preparation and play, which in turn complemented the monster hunting simulation. Their main complaint is that Monster Hunter strays further and further into a pure action game. And the more things are streamlined, the more they push you into going to the monster quickly, then the less room there is for the hunting simulation aspect, which these players value so highly. Monster Hunter's original tracking system involved either wandering around the map when you're new, or understanding the monster spawn locations when you're experienced, and then locating the monster and hitting it with a paintball. The paintball then tracks its position on the map. In World, they replaced this system with the Scoutfly system, which still required some level of tracking, but was much less demanding on the player. In Rise, the tracking system was removed completely, and now the monsters are always visible on the map. The veteran players were upset with this change because it streamlines a massive part of the hunting process. Similarly, Monster Hunter World introduced a base camp that lets you manage all of your items. This, along with the fast travel to these camps, grants players access to everything they've ever collected, essentially giving them infinite healing, infinite potions, infinite of any material that they've farmed, and completely removes any of the tension you might have experienced by hunting a monster and noticing that you're running low on mega potions, because you can simply disengage and go get more. They also appreciate the slower, more methodical combat found in the older titles, and even how long it takes to heal and how long you're stuck not being able to move while you're doing it. Many of these old systems like item management and tracking systems slowed the game down and required the player to put extra care into all of their actions. They needed to be 100% sure they were ready to depart on the quest. The veteran players that enjoy these systems see them as part of the overall game experience that makes Monster Hunter what it is. Now, the interesting thing about this group is that it's not a monolith. Individuals in this group will overlap with the speculative ecology fans, the mainline fans, and even the Monster Hunter World fans. And they believe different things to different degrees. Some want a complete return to tradition, but some just want to get rid of the infinite camp restocks and a more involved tracking system. Some want a general increase in difficulty, and for that difficulty to be scattered across the low rank and high rank and not just centered around the endgame experience. Some want the combat to be slower, more methodical, less reliant on counters like Monster Hunter Rise. But many that want that don't necessarily want to go back to Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, they mean Monster Hunter World level of speed. There's even people like me who started in Monster Hunter World, but went back to the older titles and can see that they did in fact have things of value that could be maybe introduced in the newer games. Alright, that covers all of the different groups pretty well. My personal opinion is that we're in a very good place when it comes to how Capcom is running Monster Hunter. The fact that they're keeping the mainline and portable distinction, and that they're alternating releases between them is a very good thing. The biggest division right now in Monster Hunter is between the Monster Hunter World fans and the Monster Hunter Rise fans, and they also tend to be the most antagonistic to one another. Now that Monster Hunter Wilds is coming out, and it's obvious that it's going to be more like Monster Hunter World just like the World fans hoped, they, and any fans that overlap with them, no longer need to be afraid that the franchise is moving in a direction that they didn't understand. I suspect that both the World and Rise fans will gain a new appreciation for each other's game now that they can treat the mainline and portable releases as palate cleansers. Instead of viewing them as existential threats, they'll see them as just a way to pass the time while they wait for the next Monster Hunter game of their preference. Anyway, that's the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching.